It's the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on Better Sports Network.
Three minutes past the top of the hour here on the Better Sports Network. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show presented by the FFPC, myffpc.com. So glad that you're joining us here on what a lot of people are deeming draft night in America. This is fantasy football night in America here on BSN, and we're damn glad to have you aboard tonight. I want to remind you, the FFPC brings you this show every single week. You can win a pair of $1 million grand prizes in the FFPC this year, a $1 million grand prize in the FFPC main event, a $1 million grand prize in the Fantasy Pros Championship. You can register for those right now. Numerous drafts of those going off every single day. If you register for one, you will not be waiting long. We're probably going to pump up well over 24 Fantasy Pros Championship drafts today and several FFPC main events tonight. You can also play fantasy football year-round with Dynasty Leagues at myffpc.com. 1,500-plus leagues over nearly a decade. None have ever folded. Couple of best ball tournaments going on there, as well as closed 12-team leagues going on at myffpc.com for as little as $5. So make sure you're heading on over to myffpc.com. Eric Balkman here. I'm at Eric Balkman on Twitter, the host of the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, the RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown, and here on the Better Sports Network. Want to welcome in Jack Miller from Establish the Run, at Establish the Run on Twitter. Jack is at Jack Miller 0202. I don't even know this. You have the moniker now of the first ever two-time guest on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show. Welcome aboard, man.
Wow, what an honor. I mean, thank you guys for having me back on. I'm excited to be here, excited to talk some football.
You know, I don't know if there's going to be enough time, but like, I know you play a lot of fantasy, but like, I feel like your expertise is really betting, right?
Yeah, I've gotten pretty into the betting side of things over the past couple of years. I think it kind of lends itself to betting if you're pretty into fantasy, like the player props, because you know we're spending the entire summer projecting players and setting our expectations. So going into the season, like we have a better idea of what we can expect from individual players than some of the sports books.
Yeah, and I think, and that's crucial, and I want to get into that. And by the way, anytime you have any analysis on that pertains to what we're talking about, feel free to bring that up, because I know all of our high-stakes players that are watching this are heavy into that this year, and they want to make sure that not only they're hammering it for their drafts, but they're hammering it for week one when we're out at Planet Hollywood next week for the live events for the FFPC. So coming up on tonight's show, we're going to get into a lot of preseason news. There's still stuff going around. Obviously, the 53-man rosters have been finalized. I say that in quotation marks because we're seeing little addendums to the 53-man rosters around the league. We'll get into that here in the first segment. Coming up in the second segment, obviously we'll do the running back report and get Jack's feel on not only the Jonathan Taylor situation, but Breece Hall, how he's coming along. And then we'll get into some Devin Achane, Miles Sanders stuff, as well as some sleeper running backs in that segment too. In the second hour tonight, we're going to find out where Jack stands on from a redraft fantasy football sense on a lot of polarizing players around the NFL. Najee Harris, Kyron Williams, Jahan Dotson, Hayden Hurst, Luke Musgrave, and much more. That'll be leading off hour number two. And then Jack is actually in an FFPC main event slow draft right now that is roughly halfway through, and we'll get a sense on how he feels about the team and where you can follow this team and find out, you know, the thoughts and narrative behind trying to win $1 million. Jack, this is an Establish the Run draft. It's Mike Leone and somebody else involved.
Yeah,
in this draft
it's me, Leone, and then Mark Dankenbring. We're kind of the three guys that do the projections for ETR on the NFL side. So we figured we should jump in a draft together.
Yeah, and we're going to get to not only your process and how you've been completing that draft, but I want to get your thought process and how you sort of attacked it. Again, about halfway through on that. That's coming up before we sign off tonight and give way to Garrett Price and the Dynasty Nerds. Okay, let's get into some player evaluation. Brett Veach, the GM for the Kansas City Chiefs, said that Rashee Rice and Justin Ross, who made the team, by the way, are going to start off as package players this season. But he hopes by the end of the season, they're every down wide receivers. Now, Before we get into this, Jack, I think it's important to understand where these players are going in drafts as far as Kansas City receivers go. Sky Moore is being drafted first at wide receiver 43. Kadarius Toney not too far after wide receiver 49 in the early 10th round. Rice is actually popping off as a late 12th round pick, followed by Valdez-Scantling as a late 16th round pick, and then Justin Ross, late 17th round, Richie James, early 18th round. I don't know if that's the most wide receivers being drafted by any team in the NFL in either the Fantasy Pros Championship or the FFPC main event right now, but it's right up there. We're having 6 Kansas City receivers being drafted. I think that we can call it the Patrick Mahomes effect. Your thoughts on drafting either Rashee Rice in the end of the 12th or Justin Ross at the end of the 17th, knowing that what we heard from their GM is basically like, look, these guys are not going to be a big part of your fantasy team for the first part of the season, but we're hoping by the end of the year, they are more than package players, that they're out there quite a bit. Is this an easy way to, fade Rice and Ross and then, maybe look at guys like Toney and Sky Moore early on in drafts? And by early, I mean, Sky Moore is still a 9th round pick. He's the first Chiefs receiver going off the board.
Yeah, I've kind of cooled on Rice over the past couple weeks, and that Veach quote kind of just reinforces that. I mean, we saw how the Chiefs used Sky Moore last year when he was, similar draft capital to Rashee Rice, and how they just kind of eased him in. He played situationally. I think that's kind of what we can expect from Rice to start. And then if he plays well, then he can grow into a larger role. And I think that's basically what Veach is getting at, that they hope he's an every down player by the end of the year. It's basically just they hope he plays well enough to demand a bigger role. But, in the 12th round, it's kind of hard to bet on a guy that is going to play a minority of snaps by a long shot to open the season. Ross, I haven't been drafting a lot this whole offseason. I think there was like a point in the offseason when I wasn't even sure he was going to make the 53-man roster. Obviously he has, and that's, good for him. It's a great story as well. But once Toney comes back, I mean, they have 7 receivers. I don't know if all 7 of them are going to be active on game day. I don't know if Ross is the first guy out or if it's Justin Watson. It's probably not Richie James because he does return duties. But I see the upside in Justin Ross. But I haven't been drafting him much this offseason, and I'm kind of continuing with that now.
It's interesting that you say that, because when we look at those Chiefs receivers, obviously everybody loves Mahomes and Kelsey, and then after that, it's kind of a crapshoot. Again, I always say this, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but based on what you just said about the Chiefs receivers, is it just your approach to it is avoid them and then maybe take a shot late on a guy like Ross, who's basically free end of the 17th? I mean, you're going to be drafting in the 17th round of the main event probably in a few days here. Would you just look at a guy like Ross there and that's it? Or is there a Chiefs receiver that you think is still worth his salt, even though, the ADP for Sky Moore, early 9th, Kadarius Toney, early 10th? Would you look at either of those guys there?
I'm open to Sky Moore at his current price. All the reports from camp have been glowing. He looks like he's going to be in a full-time role to start the season with or without Kadarius Toney, really. Andy Reid has raved about him this offseason, so Sky is probably – he's the most expensive, but I think he's the guy I'm most into at cost. And then I don't mind Richie James for very cheap either, just because he was like quietly pretty good last year. And cheap pieces of the Patrick Mahomes passing offense, when they're going to be active every week, I don't mind that in the 18th round.
Richie James, mid 18th round right now. This screams of the player that is everybody's going to want to pick up after week 1, but at the same time, like the smart people were drafting him in the 18th round and you already have him on your team, which is smart. Adam Schefter from ESPN reported that Joe Burrow has actually returned to practice. Brian Callahan, the offensive coordinator for the Bengals, said that Cincinnati has a good plan in place for Joe Burrow to be ready for week 1. The question here is there is a dip on Joe Burrow as far as the quarterbacks go, Jack, after he got hurt about a month or so ago, right around a month. And now the question is, okay, quarterback 5 at the 501, is that too late? Should we be bumping up Joe Burrow knowing that it seems like he's got a pretty good chance of being ready week 1 when you consider all the weapons that you have in Cincinnati with Higgins and Chase and Mixon and Boyd and all these other guys there? There's a lot to like about Joe Burrow. Are we drafting him too late? Do we need to be bumping him up? And would you take him ahead of Lamar Jackson in drafts?
I have basically no worry about Joe Burrow and the calf issue. With that being said, I would not take him ahead of Lamar just because the rushing upside with Lamar is so good. And, all the talk from Baltimore is that they're going to pass more with Todd Monken there. I'm fine taking Burrow to stack with Chase or Higgins, but I think he lacks the upside of those top 4 guys with Hurts, Allen, Mahomes, and Lamar, just because he doesn't have the same rushing upside as any of them, and really not in the same atmosphere as Hurts, Lamar, and Allen. So I'm fine pairing him with one of the receivers if you get him, just because that's a pretty dangerous stack that can just go nuts in any given week. But I'm not really looking to take like naked Joe Burrow in the 501, but it's not because I'm concerned about the calf. It's more just, how I view him individually.
When you talk about the dual threat quarterbacks here, would you be willing to fade Joe Burrow at the 501 in the hopes that maybe you could get Justin Fields later, who has a 508 ADP right now? Is that a player that you would look at actually in favor of Joe Burrow?
Yeah, I think I'd have them about even. Honestly, I find myself, if I don't get one of those top 4 quarterbacks, I find myself waiting a little longer for someone like Deshaun Watson, Daniel Jones, Anthony Richardson, who are all dual threat guys and all have pretty low floors compared to the top 4 or 5 guys. But I think their ceilings are pretty high. So that's pretty much how I'm handling quarterback.
I'm glad you brought up Deshaun Watson. I just did a quick cursory look at the rundown. I don't think we have him on there. This is a player that I was on earlier in the season, and then the reports from the Browns beat writers said that, this offense looks bad. The passing offense looks bad. And I know injuries had something to do with that. I mean, obviously, Amari Cooper and Deshaun Watson are still trying to get on the same page this year. But I know there's people who are liking Elijah Moore. I know there's plenty of people after drafting this past weekend at the KFFSC down in Louisville, Kentucky. I know there's plenty of people on Donovan Peoples-Jones as a sleeper late. You talked about waiting on Deshaun Watson, waiting on quarterback in favor of Deshaun Watson over guys like Fields and Lawrence and Lamar Jackson, or not Lamar Jackson, but if you miss on those guys. Can you tell us a little bit about why you think you're still having faith and why FFPC drafters should still have faith on the Browns passing offense, most specifically Deshaun Watson, who's going off as quarterback 9 in the early 9th round?
Yeah, honestly, it's just because the ceiling is really high. I mean, we've seen Watson have, I think every season he played before this year, or before last year, I should say, he averaged at least 20.7 fantasy points. He has multiple seasons of like the 22 to 24 fantasy point range, which would have been top 5 numbers last year. I think his floor is like really low, but I'm not like, I think you kind of have to sacrifice that low floor in exchange for the really high ceiling. And if the floor outcome hits, then you're probably, he's not going to be usable. Maybe it's just not going to work out, but the ceiling is pretty unmatched, I think, by anyone else going that late. So it's a huge gamble, I think, but it's one I'm willing to take because most quarterbacks going, at his ADP or later does not have that kind of upside.
And I'll tell you this too, for anybody who's thinking about drafting Deshaun Watson, I know it's not the cool thing to do right now, but Watson, as Jack just pointed out, has an extraordinarily high ceiling, and because of the depth at quarterback, you can go ahead even if you don't want to wait on quarterback for several rounds. I mean, you could go with Tunga Bailoa or Anthony Richardson, 2 popular high stakes quarterbacks that are going right now, or you could wait for more safer options that won't lose you your league. Cousins, Aaron Rodgers, Jared Goff to a certain extent as well. I know Russell Wilson, a lot of people are betting on a bounce back. And I still subscribe to the Brock Purdy, Jordan Love scheme of things too. When you can talk about getting both those guys as late as you are, 16th, 17th round, I think there's some upside there as well. So don't think that if you take Deshaun Watson in your 9th round, your whole draft hangs on the balance of that pick. It doesn't. You can still make up for it later on if Watson misses. I did not have this on my Jets bingo card, Jack. Tyler Conklin, according to Zach Rosenblatt, who covers the Jets for The Athletic, said that Conklin could be the Jets' number 2 pass catcher behind Garrett Wilson this season. Rosenblatt's quote from his article on The Athletic: he had a great training camp and clearly already has chemistry with Rodgers. As it stands right now, Conklin might be 2nd or 3rd in the pecking order for Rodgers behind Garrett Wilson, maybe Lazard, and should get a healthy number of targets, especially in the red zone. With Zach Wilson and everything else the Jets had last year, Conklin 58 catches, 552 yards, 552 touchdowns. To quote Kenny Mayne, would be a record or something. 3 touchdowns for Conklin with the Jets last year, and it seems like he is the move tight end for New York. CJ Uzomah, great blocker, and the Jets are probably going to use him as such this year. When you look at Tyler Conklin in the Fantasy Pros Championship, again, FFPC scoring here over the last 48 hours, Conklin comes at tight end 23 at the 15-10. Based on this report from Rosenblatt, Jack, I mean, we should be all over this guy, right?
Yeah, I think he's a solid bet at his ADP. I don't think he'll finish second on the Jets in targets. I think Allen Lazard would have to be the favorite for that honor. But I do think that Conklin is going to be in for a pretty decent workload. He might not have that much upside just because he's not like an explosive guy. So he's going to, I think in PPR and especially in FFPC with the tight end premium, he's going to catch a good amount of balls, and that's going to probably lead to him outperforming the tight end 23 ADP. I don't think he has like top 6 season in his range of outcomes. But I think he's a pretty likely bet to outperform his ADP. He in the Jets' last preseason game that Rodgers played, he did only play 5 snaps while CJ Uzomah played 6. But that was certainly strange, but I'm kind of inclined to think it was just noise, considering everything else out of Jets camp is that Conklin is one of the stars of camp, and it's only a 10-snap sample. So I'm not really putting that much stock into it, but it's definitely something to watch in week 1.
This is fascinating, and I know we got the live events going on. Again, I think I alluded to this earlier with the FFPC. Those start up this coming Thursday, 1 week from today. All the high-stakes players will be descending upon Las Vegas, Nevada, and drafting all these players. You talked about it, tight end premium with the FFPC. Conklin could be a guy 15th round right now, man. Even if he's the 3rd target behind Lazard and Wilson, that guy's got to shoot up in ADP. That could be a riser as we look at the next 7 days of drafting here. Let's continue with Zach Rosenblatt's reporting here from The Athletic on the Jets. He reported that Cobb is, quote, going to play a bigger role in this offense than expected. He is going to be 32 years old this season. I hesitate to endorse him, but Rosenblatt just continues with this. He thinks Cobb is going to be the starting slot receiver for the Jets. And they're buddies. Cobb and Rodgers obviously are buddies. But Rosenblatt, a guy who has not seen the Rodgers-Cobb connection over the course of the last nearly decade here in Green Bay, where I am in Northeast Wisconsin, he reported that Cobb has looked like the Jets' best option as a slot receiver. Best option. Corey Davis no longer there. He retired. I would imagine that Mecole Hardman is more of a threat as a 9-route downfield guy than a slot guy. Lazard, Wilson on the outside, Tyler Conklin at tight end, Cobb in the slot. Is there, and he's not being drafted in the FFPC right now. I'll tell you that right now, Jack, that nobody is on Cobb. But should we be on Cobb? Should we be looking at this guy as a late round pick, or are we better off shooting for the moon rather than sort of swinging for a double as the Randall Cobb pick would be in the 19th, 20th round right now?
Yeah, I think I would rather shoot for the moon in the 19th and 20th round. I just think Cobb doesn't have the level of upside we're looking for. Maybe if you're playing like a PPR best ball league where you have no waivers, maybe, he has a handful of usable weeks. But if you have a league where you can drop a guy, I'd much rather shoot for the moon and maybe get a guy who can actually be a weekly contributor to your team. And then if it doesn't work out, you just move on, because I don't see a whole lot of upside with 32-year-old Randall Cobb.
Yeah, 32 years old, and it's not like he's a 6'3", 210-pound behemoth on the outside, right? He's a slot guy. And I know Rodgers and him are buddies, but Rodgers and him have been buddies for many years, and there's been many years where Cobb was kind of an afterthought for fantasy. So I think while it's weird to see this kind of reporting, it's also important to understand that this is more noise for fantasy rather than news. So stay away from Randall Cobb. And again, go shoot for the moon with those late round picks. That's what you should be doing. Zay Flowers is a guy not shooting for the moon anymore because this guy has moved up so much over the course of the summer, Jack. He caught 2 catches, both his targets, for 37 yards and a touchdown in the Ravens' loss to the Commanders in the preseason. He has definitely separated himself as the Baltimore receiver to own this year. Zay Flowers is going off the board as wide receiver 38 in the early 8th round. He goes off the board at the 802. That's ahead of Rashad Bateman by about 2.5 rounds. Bateman, wide receiver 51 at the 1006, and Odell Beckham not far behind wide receiver 53 at the 1104. Flowers continues to make great plays. In preseason, we've seen the clips from Ravens practices that they can share, what have you. He's a rookie, but this is a rookie that seems to be the most attractive guy in a Todd Monken offense that views passing the ball as a good alternative to passing the ball in his offenses over the course of the years. I look at Flowers and I see nothing but upside here, and the fact that I can still get him in the 8th round in the FFPC or the Fantasy Pros Championship. I mean, to me, that's like a slam dunk number 4 receiver, maybe a borderline number 3 receiver this year. Are we sleeping on Zay Flowers? Should this guy be going higher than he actually is?
Yeah, I'm with you on Zay Flower. I'm buying him as he continues to climb. I think, first round draft capital, crushing in camp, could be a day one starter, should be a day one starter in 3 receiver sets. And, in an offense that promises to be more pass heavy this year. So I'm in on Zay Flowers. I don't mind Bateman 2.5 rounds later either. Odell's kind of the guy I haven't been drafting as much, mostly just because he's older. But yeah, Zay especially is the main guy I'm targeting. Zay and Andrews really are the 2 that I'm pretty into in this offense. And then Bateman is someone I'm fine drafting as well.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit about, and by the way, I'm with you on those receivers, but I want to get your take on the Odell Beckham thing, because when I've been off Beckham for quite some time because he was always dealing with an injury. He wasn't getting any younger. So for me, it was kind of like he was an easy fade. But now, not now, but like when the Ravens signed him to that deal and I saw all that guaranteed money, and I'm like, I usually follow the money on stuff like this, Jack. And then I'm like, what am I missing on Beckham? And high stakes players are still letting him slide. Obviously, as I just pointed out, they're letting him slide to the early 11th round right now. Am I not missing anything? Why is it important for Beckham specifically to not view the guaranteed money he got from Baltimore as the primary reason to look at him in the mid rounds of FFPC drafts?
I mean, I think he'll be on the field a lot to start the year. It's just he's been away from the game for a year. We don't know if he can be healthy. We don't know if he's the same player that he was 2 years ago. And I mean, I think there's a good chance that at this stage of their careers, Zay and Bateman are just better players, and they end up distancing themselves throughout the season, especially Flowers. I think since he's a rookie, maybe he doesn't come in and light the world on fire in week 1. I mean, hopefully he does, because I've been drafting him a good amount, but I think realistically he's probably not going to do that in week 1. But as the season progresses, there's a lot of evidence out there that rookies get better fantasy wise as the season goes on. So I think Beckham should see a lot of snaps to start the year, but there's a chance that he just kind of gets marginalized by 2 potentially better players at this stage of their respective careers. Or he just can't stay healthy anymore.
Yeah. Philosophical question for you on something you just brought up with the rookies. Given that the money weeks are always coming, 3/4 of the way of the season or the end of the regular season for the NFL, but the end of the postseason in fantasy, do you find yourself, especially in best ball leagues, drafting rookie, whether they be running backs, receivers, tight ends, whatever, knowing that they're going to hit their crescendo during the money weeks? Do you feel like they are undervalued in like the FFPC best ball tournament, Fantasy Pros, main event, stuff like that?
I think so. I do find myself drafting rookies a good amount, and especially in these like big tournaments where all of the money is doled out based on what happens in the last 3 weeks. I do think that they're a little undervalued as a whole. I do think that like you have to mix them. Like you can't have, Zach Charbonnet, Jackson Smith and Jigba, like all these guys who might not contribute week 1. And you have to have some level of production in week 1 just to make sure you get there. So you could mix someone like a Charbonnet with someone like, maybe we'll get to this in a moment, but like Raheem Mostert, who's pretty likely to contribute heavily in week 1, but there's a lot of questions on if he can hold that up for an entire season.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Mostert. I want to get to him for sure, obviously with the Jeff Wilson news today. But before we do, to stay on the Ravens just for a second, you talked about how you like Bateman, you liked Andrews, you obviously like Zay Flowers this year. I don't have the running backs on the rundown. What about J.K. Dobbins? He's going off the board as running back 22 at the 601. He gave a cryptic comment to some member of the Baltimore media of like, you're going to have to wait and see or wait and find out about how involved he's going to be in the passing game this year. And we know that Monken, his offense loves to throw the ball. I'm honestly wondering at this point, J.K. Dobbins, who's going behind guys like Javonte Williams, who's coming off the injury, Alexander Madison, who is just kind of has been a guy, unless the opportunity presented itself in Minnesota, and then Jonathan Taylor, who God knows when he's going to play again. Dobbins is going behind all these guys. Do you feel like there's some value in drafting J.K. Dobbins, especially if you go like a 0 RB or something like that, where you can get Dobbins in the early 6th round that like, hey, this is the type of guy who could win me $1 million in the FFPC this year as my running back one if I load up on wide receiver and tight end prior to that?
Yeah, I'm open to Dobbins. I wouldn't say I'm like going out of my way to draft him. I think it's going to be like we kind of know what to expect in that he'll be the carries leader, at least among the running backs. He'll be probably super efficient, but he's going to give up some work to Gus Edwards. And the passing down work, we haven't really seen it from him to this stage in his career. And with Lamar Jackson there, some of those quarterback checkdowns to the running backs are going to become Lamar Jackson runs. So maybe we see a little bit more passing work, but especially with Lamar there and with Justice Hill maybe figuring in on 3rd down sometimes, I don't think that we can, get too crazy with our expectations on Dobbins receiving. So I'm okay with Dobbins. I'll draft him if he falls like a little bit past ADP, or if I need a running back and he's at the top of the queue, but he's not someone I am, targeting super heavily.
And I think that's the proper approach. Like that's how, when I was drafting in the Kentucky Fantasy Football State Championship in Louisville this past weekend, when it came to me, if like Dobbins was still out there, I needed a running back, I reluctantly took him and I was okay with it, but he's certainly not a guy I'm targeting by any means. And I'll tell you a guy that was not being targeted, at least it seemed like, by anybody drafting this past weekend. And the players that I was drafting against this last weekend, they're going to be drafting in the FFPC. I mean, there's a really strong high-stakes player presence out there for sure this year. Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 31 is where he's fallen to, Jack. 608 right now. He is now behind guys like Brandon Ayuk, Christian Kirk, Tyler Lockett, George Pickens, and he is back-to-back with Jahan Dotson. I don't want to talk about Jahan Dotson quite yet. We'll get to him later in the show. But from a standpoint of Sam Howell being the quarterback, McLaurin, as of right now, being the number 1 wide receiver, but dealing with an injury as he got hurt in that Baltimore Ravens preseason game. 608 right now. How do you view McLaurin when you roll into the mid-6th round? Are you looking at him? Is he a guy that you take a chance on, or a guy you're fading because you don't want to be drafting injured players before the season starts?
I think he's at the point now where I'm fine drafting him. The ADP has fallen significantly, and it doesn't sound like it's going to cost him like that much of the season. So I think now that he's fallen into the mid-6th, he's more fairly valued. I do prefer not to draft the injured guys, and turf toe, it's been kind of an interesting dichotomy because all the stuff from Washington has been pretty optimistic, but like the Twitter doctors are saying that turf toe is like a really lingering injury. So that still scares me a little bit. Honestly, in the 6th round, I probably still am not drafting him that much, but I do think it's getting to the point where like I'm almost open to it again.
He could be the type of guy that again, like you're trying to win $1 million. Maybe the turf toe isn't as bad as we thought, and he doesn't battle it after September, and he becomes a guy that comes on late in the season and helps you win a 7-figure grand prize. That is certainly within the realm of possibilities. I told you Huey's going behind. He's currently going ahead of Dotson, Judy, Mike Evans, Addison, Gabe Davis, players like that. If he keeps slipping, he becomes a buy for sure in that. Don't forget a Fantasy Alarm All-Pro subscription plus Fantasy Football Draft Guide and the cheat sheet there at Fantasy Alarm is available right now when you start a free 7-day trial of Fantasy Alarm's All-Pro subscription. Get the Fantasy Football Draft Guide and cheat sheet for free. Just go to fantasyalarm.com/draft, fantasyalarm.com/draft. Jack Miller from Established the Run joining me tonight. Make sure you're following him on x.com at JackMiller02. When we come back, it's the running back report. Jack already teased a little bit. Jeff Wilson got placed on IR today. How do we treat Raheem Mostert? How do we treat Devin Achane, who's dealing with an injury by himself? The latest on Jonathan Taylor Gate, plus more on Dameon Pierce. We're going to talk a little bit about the Eagles running back situation, a nebulous cacophony of misinformation that nobody can seem to decipher right now. in high-stakes leagues with the FFPC. Jack Miller from Established Run, Eric Balkman from the FFPC. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show right here on Better Sports Network. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be back right after this.
I feel like this is a quietly contentious point in Dynasty Fantasy Football, what it means to actually be rebuilding. Some people say you should never truly be rebuilding. How do you view the rebuilding versus competing dichotomy in Dynasty?
So I will be the first person to acknowledge that my preferred format of fantasy football is just redraft. The years that I have played Dynasty, it has been I've drafted a win now team because I've seen people that have just gotten into the cycle of rebuilding and thus they just don't make any progress. So if you're rebuilding for the 5th year in a row, I just, I don't know exactly how you get out of it, but yeah, it's definitely something that can happen. And a lot of people, especially when we come out of the NFL draft, everyone's just instantly shipping off, draft picks and everything. So, I mean, it's definitely something that can happen.
Joey, do you feel similarly to it? Do you feel like you see people getting stuck in the rebuilding loop?
I mean, I would say people that try to rebuild in the beginning of seasons, of their fantasy seasons, I see them get stuck in that rut. I would really try to only ever rebuild if I knew I was going to miss the playoffs. Like, I'm always trying to play to win, even if it's maybe I don't know.
I think my big thing is the word rebuild is a much shorter time frame than I think most people say it should be. Like, they look at rebuild as like 3 years out competing. Rebuild, you're looking to compete next season. You know what I mean? Like, if you're doing it now, you're looking to revamp, and maybe there's a one season where you ship it off, but that very next season you should be competing. If you're doing it like that, I'm cool with it, but you gotta have a plan, not just keep getting the young players, keep getting the draft picks. Otherwise, you end up like Tim. Maybe not like Tim who gets a bye, but you make the playoffs, you're in that like 4 to 6 range every year, just hovering in the middle. Nothing ever gets better, nothing ever gets worse.
I think I play like you in Dynasty, Simon. I play in 3-year windows.
100%. That's my go-to. And with the rate at which Dynasty leagues turn over, you should really only ever play in a 3-year window.
The FFPC is home to season-long fantasy football, to 2 separate $1 million grand prize contests, the FFPC main event, the Fantasy Pros Championship. Plus, we got best ball leagues, dynasty leagues, the Terminator tournament, which is going on strong, the FFPC Weekly Challenge, which will start up in about a week or so, all at myffpc.com. Actually, use promo code ALARM, ALARM, at myffpc.com for an exclusive offer. Get $25 off your first FFPC entry of $35 or more. Go to myffpc.com. That's myffpc.com. Use promo code ALARM. I'm being joined by Jack Miller from Establish the Run this evening here, making his return appearance on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show. I'm Eric Balkman from the FFPC. You kind of teased this, and I'll tell you, and I've talked about my KFFSC drafting that I did this past weekend. Drafted a dozen teams over the course of the weekend. And when I look back on my teams, Jack, I realized, holy cow, Jonathan Taylor better not be traded to the Miami Dolphins because I have way too much Devon Achane, right? So dodge that bullet on Tuesday where he did not get traded to the Miami Dolphins, even though there was a lot of smoke there. And then we found out that Jeff Wilson was actually going to be going on IR for the Dolphins. Mike McDaniel was asked about this morning, and Mike McDaniel used some interesting language to talk about this. He said he, quote, wouldn't be surprised if Jeff Wilson returned this season. I mean, we're already talking about a this season type thing, and it's August 31st, and he's already saying that he wouldn't be surprised if he comes back this season. Multiple injuries, which I don't know how they weren't reported on. He's got a finger issue. He's got a core muscle issue. McDaniel's saying that Jeff Wilson's body is going to tell the Dolphins when he is ready to play. At the earliest, because he was placed on IR today, at the earliest, he will not be eligible until week 5. Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, they don't have to contend with Jonathan Taylor. Now they don't have to contend with Jeff Wilson. And I look at where these guys are being drafted. My God, you got to be pumping in some Mostert and A-Chain based on where they're going. And I'll tell you right now, before you answer this question, Raheem Mostert, his ADP, again, over the last 48 hours in the FFPC Fantasy Pros Championship, you're looking at an 11-10 ADP as running back 49, and A-Chain is right in front of him at running back 48 at the 11-10. Jack, both of these ADPs are going to shoot way up. Which guy are you more likely to draft this year based on the Wilson news here?
I think I'm actually more into Mostert, which might be unpopular, but A-Chain ran as the RB5 in Miami's preseason games. And, it's not, I think he might still be behind Sullivan Ahmed to open the season. Obviously, you're not really drafting A-Chain for week one production, but we've seen time and time again how much McDaniel trusts Mostert. So I kind of think as long as he's healthy, which is a huge question mark, he's going to be the guy. The question, of course, Mostert is, I think, 31 years old. So can he stay healthy? But that's why he's going to be going in the 9th or 10th round and not the 4th round, right? So A-Chain's a guy I think he could start like really slowly. And I'm not ruling out a second half of the season breakout, but I'm not going out of my way to draft him because I think there's a chance that like he has 1 or 2 touches in week one and people just kind of give up on him early, and maybe you can get him at a cheaper cost later.
The other thing I didn't mention about A-Chain, Mike McDaniel reported 10 days ago today that A-Chain is actually week to week with a shoulder injury. Not day to day, not hour to hour, week to week. That's probably not a glowing endorsement, and I think more fuel to the fire for Raheem Mostert. I mean, how important is it for you when you're talking about basically getting these guys at the same spot in the FFPC main event right now? How important is it to you, Jack, to get off to a fast start? Because obviously Mostert's going to help you get there, but you like to think that HA will be coming into his own during the money weeks of the season. It's an interesting comparison here on how to do it, but you lean towards Mostert.
Yeah, I lean towards Mostert. I think A-Chain might need an injury to be that relevant. I mean, I think McDaniel really trusts Mostert. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm putting too much stock into the preseason usage, but he was RB5 in the preseason. Now he's hurt and he's missing valuable practice time. So it just...
And he's a rookie, obviously, too. I mean, like, for a veteran missing practice time, we don't make that big of a stink out of it. But with A-Chain, we kind of have to.
Yeah, it's just kind of a scary situation to me.
Let's move on and talk about Jonathan Taylor Gate. I feel like because of this Jeff Wilson news, that it prevented Jonathan Taylor from leading off the running back report every single week on this show for like the last month and a half. Chris Ballard has said that Jonathan Taylor is, quote, still complaining of pain in his ankle, which in part led him to being placed on the PUP list for the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts, as a reminder, they gave Jonathan Taylor permission to seek a trade. They said it's got to be done by Tuesday when the 53-man rosters had to be announced. It didn't happen. And as a result, Taylor gets placed on the PUP list. To the Colts' credit, Taylor did deal with an ankle injury last season and also had off-season ankle surgery to clean out his ankle, but we don't know how bad the injury is. Taylor says he was never dealing with back pain, although there have been reports that Taylor was dealing with back pain as well. I don't really know what to do with Jonathan Taylor here. In those cases, Jack, I usually just kind of I'm under the impression that, like, you know what, somebody else is going to like him better than me. So I don't want to say he's off my board, but I don't really consider him because I know at the point I would consider him, he's going to be long gone. I thought he would slip further in Fantasy Pros and FFPC drafts right now. He has not. Running back 20 at the 509. Now, 2 days ago, he did end up going as late as the 806 in the draft, right? And I think that'd be more my wheelhouse because this guy led the league in rushing 2 years ago, right? But at the same time, you look at the situation this year in Indianapolis. Forget about the injury stuff and the contract stuff for a second. Look at the situation. Anthony Richardson there. Usually a young mobile quarterback is not conducive to big-time running back production. So I think even without the injury, without the contract stuff, there's still a lot to dislike about Jonathan Taylor. And the fact that he is still going at the end of the 5th round, man, I'm going to find a better usage for my late 5th round pick than Jonathan Taylor. I am not a strong enough man to do it.
Yeah, I think so too. I think in the late 5th round, he'd have to fall a pretty good amount past that for me to be interested. And I'm in a similar boat where I honestly just have no idea what to do with him. And I think it does just make more sense to just let someone else draft him in those situations. I'm really curious where the market's going to settle on him, because I truly have no idea what's going to happen here and no idea how to treat him at this point. The Colts were making it sound, if the reports are true, they were demanding Jalen Waddle for Taylor, which is an
plus draft picks.
Yeah,
plus draft picks,
which is an unbelievable demand. And if that's the case, and if they hold that up, then he's not going anywhere. And I don't know if he's gonna play for the Colts in Week 5, even if he's healthy. It sounds like the relationship is so severed. So I have no idea really. And especially at late 5th round draft price, I'll just let someone else draft him.
So let's do a quick not name game. Would you rather here with Jonathan Taylor? I'm going to give you some running backs that are going behind him in drafts right now. You tell me who you'd prefer between Jonathan Taylor and Rachaad White.
That's tough. I might be too scared, too prisoner of the moment, but I honestly might go White there.
Okay. Jonathan Taylor or Alvin Kamara?
I think I'd go Taylor there.
Okay. Last one. Maybe not the last one. Jonathan Taylor or Cam Akers?
That's probably, I think, pretty fair. I don't know. Okay. I don't know exactly where FFPC ADP is, or if Akers is behind Kamara.
He is. I'm going down in descending order. So Kamara, it basically goes like this after Taylor: James Cook, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, J.K. Dobbins, who we already talked about, then Rachaad White, then Kamara, Miles Sanders, who we're going to talk about, then Cam Akers. So you're talking about, and this is kind of an unfair question, but because Taylor is going on average about a round and a half earlier than Cam Akers right now. So I think that might figure into it a little bit, where I guess I have to ask you, okay, would you rather have Jonathan Taylor in the late 5th or take somebody else in the late 5th and then grab a guy like Cam Akers in the late 6th, early 7th?
Yeah, definitely. But I do think it's an interesting question, because, if we had this conversation 4 days from now, it easily could be Taylor or Akers, just because I haven't seen much public optimism from people on Taylor. It kind of seems like everyone's fading him. So I think that ADP might drop in the coming days.
I thought it would draft further
than
it already has, and it hasn't happened yet. But you're right. I mean, when push comes to shove, we could see that. I think too, a lot of people who are investing money into, whether it's $350 into the Fantasy Pros Championship or a $2,000 entry fee for your first entry into the FFPC main event, I often feel like, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit, when I play the same contest, I often feel like my first entry or my first 2 entries are a little bit more cautious. But my entries after that, I get into gunslinger mode, and then I start taking more chances. And that'd be a time to take chances on Jonathan Taylor. But if you're only going to play 1 or 2, maybe not the right time to hitch your wagon to Jonathan Taylor in the mid to late 5th.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, I don't know if it's the best way to think about it, but I definitely fall victim to that same idea, where if you're building a huge portfolio, you're kind of what's one share of Jonathan Taylor how's that going to hurt?
Breece Hall is another player that I think has been, I think polarizing is too strong of a word right now, but the guy is coming off an ACL tear, and he has also his team has undergone a makeover in the running back room, with Dalvin Cook being added now too. Robert Saleh said this week that the team is going to be smart with how they use Breece Hall coming off the ACL. You look at the ADP right now, Breece Hall is running back 15 at the 411. He is going ahead of guys like Kenneth Walker, Dameon Pierce, Javonte Williams, Jonathan Taylor, Alexander Madison as well. Do you view Breece Hall as a pick to win type guy, especially if you have loaded up on receivers, or maybe 2 receivers and a tight end in your first 3 rounds, and you're drafting at that back end of the 4th, early 5th? Does that seem like a smart pick for you this year, Jack, with Breece Hall at the end of the 4th?
Yeah, I think he's a solid pick. He's not someone I'm, slamming every single draft, but I do think that he's slightly undervalued right now. I think the Jets are going to take it slow with him, but he showed last year that he's one of the most talented backs in the league. This is going to be a solid offense with Aaron Rodgers under center. He's kind of a guy where you have to build your team around the fact that you have him, especially if he's your first running back. Like if you have Brees as your RB1, you probably shouldn't draft Charbonnet as your RB2 and then A-Chain as your RB3, because then you're just going to have no production in week one. But in a vacuum, and especially if you do think about that and take the fact that he's not going to produce much early in the year into consideration, I think he has amazing potential late in the year, and he could be a league winner down the stretch.
I think that's a good way to look at it too, and especially like with my shares of him in Dynasty, I've kind of shied away from selling him at 85 cents or 90 cents on the dollar. I want to make sure that I'm going to get vintage Brees Hall. And vintage Brees Hall is a total oxymoron. It doesn't exist. But like what I saw from him prior to the injury with Brees Hall, I think that could be very compelling for somebody who is trying to win a fantasy or dynasty championship this year. To have Brees Hall, to be able to deploy him late in the season, he could be a league winner. A guy that I've drafted a few times this year, Jack, but I wouldn't say I've targeted him, is Miles Sanders in Carolina. Now, he's dealing with a groin injury right now. He said a little over a week ago that he's going to be ready for week one against the Atlanta Falcons. He's been eased back into practice. Frank Reich has already said that he was a little unsure on this injury. It seems like he is going to be the running back one for Carolina this year. Chuba Hubbard, Raheem, Blackshear behind him there. Miles Sanders' ADP in the Fantasy Pros Championship over the last 48 hours, he is coming in at running back 25 at the 6'10". For me, if I'm playing zero RB or if I'm loading up on tight ends or receivers or whatever, to get Miles Sanders as my number one running back is something I want to do in the late 6th round. Is that smart? I mean, I know you got to hit up a lot of running backs after Miles Sanders, but is it smart to wait if you load up on wide receiver, tight end, and then grab Miles Sanders at the end of the 6th? Is that a smart thing to do, to have him in that situation, Jack, as your number one running back this year?
I think he's an all-right option. I don't think it's a slam dunk, but I do think we're going to see more receiving production this year in Carolina than what we saw with him with the Eagles. It's mostly just concerns about the Panthers offense as a whole. They did not look good in preseason. They have a rookie quarterback. They have not the worst group of pass catchers in the world, but a group of pass catchers that is currently banged up. And, a lot of them have concerns about sustaining it for the whole season with Chark's injury history and Thielen getting up there in age. So it kind of comes down to what you think of the Panthers offense and how much the RB1 in that offense is worth and how much upside that role has. I think he's a fine option. I think he's going to be the RB1 there. Chuba's going to be involved, but Sanders is still going to be the primary back. And so I think he's a fine pick. I'm not rushing to the podium for him, but if he falls, I'll draft him.
I think that's you and I are one of the same mind on that one too with Sanders. I think that's how it is. I wouldn't target him, but if the opportunity presents itself and my team construction up until that point looks like it could support him, then yeah, I'm all over him. People ask me all the time, especially this time of year, Balky, who are you seeing as the big riser? What player is shooting up draft boards that, if I drafted a week ago, he'd be a slam dunk pick at his ADP. Now I actually have to think about it because he's been going high. I think of guys like Calvin Ridley, who's been ascending over the last month plus. Jahmyr Gibbs, basically since he was drafted by the Lions, has been going up as well. But another player that's kind of subtly going up, and I want to get your insight on Dameon Pierce, is the starting running back for the Houston Texans. A player over the last 48 hours in Dameon Pierce, who has been going as wide receiver, running back 17 at the 503. He has moved ahead of Javonte Williams, Taylor, Alexander Madison, and James Cook. He played every offensive snap when the Texans had their first team offense out there in their preseason finale against the Dolphins. And I look at this player as a guy who has talked about wanting to hone his pass catching skills, reportedly has worked really hard on it, and also reportedly not looked bad on catching passes for the Texans this year. Is Dameon Pierce actually undervalued right now when we look at drafting him as the running back 17 in the early 5th round of the Fantasy Pros Championship, Jack?
I don't think he's undervalued anymore. I think I would take Madison over him. But I don't think he's that overvalued by any means. I think the preseason usage has been really encouraging. It looks like Devin Singletary, who some people thought was going to force a committee, it looks like Singletary is basically just a handcuff at this point.
At best,
yeah,
at best.
At best, yeah. So I think Pierce is in for a big workload. It's kind of a similar thing with Sanders, where it's just how much trust you have in CJ Stroud to deliver you someone with RB1 upside. I think the volume's going to be there. The volume was also there over the second half of the season, especially for Pierce, and it didn't result in like jaw-dropping numbers. So I think Pierce is like solid. I would take Madison over him just because the offense is better. But I think Pierce is a good talent, and I think he's in for a solid workload. So I understand where all the hype is coming from, and I don't like fault the people chasing him up the board.
So I'm with you on Pierce for sure. I want to talk about Madison here for a second, because this is a player that's been tough for me to wrap my head around this offseason. When the Vikings made it clear that they were not going to be in the Dalvin Cook business for 2023, obviously I realized that Madison is going to play a key role, and this was after he had already signed that, albeit modest, but still an extension with the Minnesota Vikings. And I thought, okay, Madison's probably got to look at in the middle rounds. And then they draft, Jordan Addison. They just inked TJ Hawkinson to this big extension today. And now I'm kind of thinking, like, is Minnesota, do they want to run the ball this year? Because it feels like they're going to be throwing it all over the place with Kirk Cousins. Can you sell me a little bit on why Alexander Madison can make sense for FFPC players at the end of the 5th round as running back 19?
Yeah, I've come around on him. I started the offseason in a similar boat. And also just the fact that he's been in the league for a few years and hasn't really shown himself to be a fantastic talent. But Levitan and Silva have they're super in on him. And so they've kind of, convinced me, because the Vikings have been pretty steadfast all offseason that they're committed to Madison. They haven't signed anyone. They didn't really draft anyone. Dwayne McBride, who they then cut and added back on the practice squad. Ty Chandler and Myles Gaskin don't really seem like big of threats. And I do think the Vikings are going to be pretty pass heavy. They were last year. That's kind of Kevin O'Connell's thing, is he wants to be pass heavy, and they're built to do so. But it's going to be a high scoring offense, and it's not like they're going to be Chiefs level pass heavy. So I think the RB1, pretty clear RB1 in what's going to be a good offense, even if they pass a little bit more than average. I mean, he could catch a bunch of passes, so it's not like the pass heaviness is necessarily bad, because the reports from camp have suggested that he's been showing well as a pass catcher out of the backfield. So maybe that just results in fewer carries, but more PPR value for Madison.
And I guess that makes sense too. And you got to consider, like with anything, you got to consider the ADP here. Running back 19 at the 509. While that seems rich, you're also talking about a spot in the draft where you probably already have your starting running back and maybe 2 running backs on your team. Maybe Madison would be your 3rd. So how much are you risking there? I understand the draft capital, but at the same time, this guy does not have to play for you every week if you miss on him. And Chandler, Gaskin, all these other guys, McBride on the practice squad behind him. Nobody really should strike fear in you when it comes to Alexander Madison, or when it comes to Alexander Madison's threat for competition. Let's get into we got time here. Let's do the Eagles running back situation, and we'll try to put this jigsaw puzzle together here. Bull Wolf, who was on the Athletics football show, said he thinks Kenneth Gainwell is going to end up playing the most because he is the most reliable running back in Philadelphia, which is an interesting word usage there. When we look at the Philadelphia Eagles running backs and how the high stakes players are drafting them right now, we see that these guys are bunched up a little bit, but they're not as bunched up as they had been over the course of the last 2 months or so. 3 running backs are being taken in Philadelphia: Swift, Penny, and Gainwell. Swift comes in at the 708 as running back 29. Rashad Penny and Kenneth Gainwell are basically back-to-back here. Penny at the 1011, Kenneth Gainwell at the 1104. So as running back 42, running back 43. How do you fall in on this situation here, Jack? Would you be looking in the mid-7th round at drafting DeAndre Swift? And I'll say this too, like their last preseason game, like all the starters sat out for the offensive portion of the team, and DeAndre Swift was one of those players that sat out. So clearly the Eagles want him to be the guy, but again, we can't just draft based on what the team wants to do. We have to draft based on what's going to happen. Penny and Gainwell at the end of the 10th, early 11th. Would you be looking at either of those guys there? How do you kind of handicap this Eagles running back situation?
Yeah, I think Swift is definitely the guy to own just because he has the best combination of he's shown the ability to be a runner and a receiver, and he's basically just shown the ability to be a talented back who he hasn't stayed exactly healthy, but he's done a better job of that than Rashad Penny. So I think he's the guy to own for that 3-down upside. Penny, I think I prefer in a vacuum over Gainwell, even though I know that the court of public opinion has shifted pretty dramatically in the opposite direction over the past month or so. I was pretty in on Gainwell a month ago because of how the Eagles – I was in on him most of the offseason because the Eagles really relied on him in the playoffs, and I think that they do view him as the most reliable running back, but I think Swift and Penny just have so much more upside. If Penny stays healthy, which is very unlikely, admittedly, I mean, he's averaged 5.9 yards per career, 5.9 yards per carry in his career, and he's running behind the best offensive line in the league on a top 3 offense in the league. I think the touchdown upside here is pretty massive. I think the efficiency upside is pretty massive. So I'm willing to take a swing on that upside because that's basically what it comes down to with this Eagles backfield is I think Swift and Penny have more upside, and Gainwell might be the most reliable, but he doesn't have that really smash season in his range of outcomes as much.
Yeah, and I think that's important to understand here too, because when you're looking where these guys are being drafted, you're looking for potential smashes, not necessarily in a season-long perspective, but a guy that can step in the right situation. And if he's given 15 to 20 touches, I mean, you want him accruing 15 to 20 fantasy points for you this week. You're looking for players that can be difference makers in the middle rounds, not players that can sort of contribute every single week. You want guys that have those spike weeks, those big boom weeks as well. And that would make sense of what you're saying with the trio of Eagles running backs here too as well. I think that's important to keep in mind. We are going to be keeping in mind that we are going live for another hour here from 8 o'clock until 9 o'clock tonight here on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show. Jack Miller from Establish the Run, Eric Balkman from the FFPC. When we come back, I'm going to quiz Jack where he stands on a variety of players: Ezekiel Elliott, Najee Harris, Kyron Williams, Adam Thielen, and a ton more. So we're going to get into that as well as in the second half, the bottom of the second hour. I want to talk with Jack about his FFPC main event slow draft that he's doing right now. Find out how it's going, the chances that it could win $1 million, stuff like that. That's all coming up in the second hour. You're watching the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show right here on the Better Sports Network. Eric Balkman, Jack Miller are going to be back right with you after this.
What can we expect from you out there on the track tonight?
Listen, I have a wife, 2 kids. I have, full-time jobs. I'm never nervous. I don't even know what that word means. Can you explain what nervous means? No. I'm ready to have fun. I've never done anything like this before. I got asked to be a part of this. This is fascinating. It's so cool to just look around and see what goes on here. So I'm just excited to get out on the horse. And you want trash talk? Is that what you're asking me for? No trash talk. I hope everyone does well.
All right. Everyone's going to do well, but it has to be a winner. So give me your trifecta. Who's going to come in first, second, and third? Your heat.
I will go Maria 1, me 2, Willie 3, Moose goes 4th.
Well, it's very simple. I won this event last year. I won my heat, and so the defending champ has to be the favorite. Now, that makes me a little nervous just because I feel like it's hard to repeat. There's a little pressure when you're the favorite, but that being said, I'm still optimistic.
So your heat, it's you,
yes.
Moose and Keith from Better Sports Network, and Willie Colon.
I think Keith might be my stiffest competition, and I asked for this because I actually recruited Keith, if you didn't know. So Keith, if you win, you're welcome.
Malusis is very good. I mean, he knows what he's doing, but I'm going to go with Maria.
Keith is waving to the crowd. He must pay attention because they're off. It's Mark Malusis going for the lead. Maria Marino on the outside, and now Keith Irizarry on the outside with speed, and they're 3 wide into the first turn.
Woo!
Mark Malusis is locked in for his life. 138-2. They're into the stretch. Sportscasters Derby 2. And still in front, Keith Irizarry. And now Mark Malusis is trying to squeeze on through.
Come on! Jack! Come on! Let's go! Come on, dig it! Dig it! Yeah!
Keith Irizarry. Keith, you did it all the way, wire to wire, over Mark Malusis.
Awesome! That was so cool!
The champ is here! Keith, what was it like being out there? Adrenaline rush, you were doing the Instagram Live, so there was no panic. You looked cool, calm, collected the whole time, and you won it.
I felt really comfortable. I did. Like, I know you were joking with me before. Are you nervous? Are you whatever? What are you? David, the driver, was awesome. He's like, we're going to win this. I said, all right, let's win this. And he said, let's go. Yeah, I just felt really comfortable. I did. It was fun. We're in the lead. I got Maria Marino on the right side of me, and I'm like, oh, my gosh, she's going to beat us, right? And then out of nowhere, you see Moose coming up this way, and we feel him breathing down our neck. And I'm like,
Moose
no!
on the loose. Watch out.
Moose was definitely on the loose, and we just got Moose by a neck, a nose, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, but again, all of this for a great cause, and it was absolutely awesome to do this. It was cool.
All right, Keith, congratulations, and no matter what, you could always hold this over Moose's head.
Yeah!
5 minutes, top of the hour here on the Better Sports Network. Here we're looking live at the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show presented by the FFPC. I'm Eric Balkman from the Fantasy Football Players Championship, the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, the RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown, being joined tonight by Jack Miller from Establish the Run. You follow him on X at Jack Miller02. Did I ask you last time you were on, where did the Jack Miller 02 come from? Was there just like two other Jack Millers and you had to be the third one and you put 02 next to it, or what happened?
So I was born in 2001, and so I tried Jack Miller 01, but it was taken, so I just went to Jack Miller 02.
I love it. That's fantastic. Good stuff. And follow Jack on X at Jack Miller 02. Hey, I want to tell everybody that we are in the midst of redraft season. Everybody's loading up for the FFPC main event, the FFPC Fantasy Pros Championship, to try to win $1 million grand prize. But if you still want to play fantasy football 365 days a year, you can do so at myffpc.com when you register for a dynasty league there. They start at $100. They go all the way up to $5,000 as far as an entry goes. And we've been doing dynasty fantasy football for more than a decade. More than 1,500 leagues have popped up on our platform. Not a single one has ever folded. So you don't have to worry about shady commissioners, bad trades. You don't have to worry about, the league folding or anything like that. Go to myffpc.com, myffpc.com, register for your Dynap League. You can do a slow one. I think we still have slow ones popping off with the 2-hour time frame. But you can also do live dynasties on there too, which are always fun if you can do a live dynasty with a 60-second timer. Check it out at myffpc.com, myffpc.com. One of the players, Jack, that I did not bring up with you on purpose because I knew we would be talking about him in the Where Do You Stand segment, which is what we're doing right now, is a player that I'm a little confused as why he has not been moving up more than he already had. I think about Jahmyr Gibbs, a guy that I don't know if I'd necessarily take him in the mid-third round, but I understand why he's moving up. I don't understand why James Cook from Buffalo is not moving up. I feel like he should be, based on everything we know, rightly or wrongly, he should be going higher in drafts, and yet he's stumbling at running back 21 off the board at the end of the 5th round. This is a player that ostensibly is the lead back in one of the best offenses in the NFL. In fact, Joe Buscaglia, who covers the Bills for the Athletics, says he is the clear top back in Buffalo. Damian Harris and Latavius Murray are not battling for the starting job. They're battling for the backup job. Like, it is James Cook's job to lose. He is a former 2nd-round pick. He should be utilized more than a 3rd down, receiving back. He should be utilized on 1st and 2nd down. You look at where he's going at the end of the 5th. Again, when you're trying to win a 7-figure grand prize, I think he should be going higher. What am I missing on James Cook right now?
No, I'm with you on Cook. I think he's in a pretty good spot. We know he's a good pass catcher. Devin Singletary's gone, so he's in line for a pretty big target share on one of the best offenses in the league. I think the concern that most people have is the goal line work that might be split between Damian Harris and Latavius Murray. And it's a fair concern because the ways that fantasy running backs really score points are with those receptions and with the goal line touches and the touchdowns. And James Cook might not have a great hold of the latter. But with that being said, I think there's a world in which maybe Cook doesn't get all the goal line touches, but maybe it's not like they get in within the 5 and automatically they take them out. And so I think there's a little bit of touchdown equity there, but really it's just he's going to be the primary early down back. He's going to catch pretty good amount of passes on one of the best offenses in the league, and I think that's a pretty good bet to make.
I think so too. Does the fact that Josh Allen, that he represents a player that is able to go out and get a first down or a touchdown with his legs because of his rushing prowess, does that affect the way that you view James Cook at all, or maybe it affects it, but it's a minute detail? How do you sort of take that into account when you're thinking about drafting James Cook this year?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a consideration. I don't think that Cook is going to score 10 touchdowns this year, but I think that maybe he could score like 6 rushing touchdowns. And I think that if you combine that with maybe a receiving touchdown or 2, and then just the amount of passes that he has the potential to catch, I think you're looking at a pretty good season. And I think a lot of that is baked into cost. Like, I think if James Cook was going to be the goal line guy, I mean, you're talking about like a 3rd round pick. So I think that the Damian Harris, the Latavius, the Josh Allen getting the goal line carries ahead of him, I think that's already baked into his cost.
What about Ezekiel Elliott, the New England Patriot here? Bill O'Brien, the offensive coordinator for the Patriots who's taking over this year, said that he thinks Elliott is capable of contributing on all 3 downs. Said that he's a really good addition to the Patriots. Ezekiel Harris, you would think, based on last year's usage, is going to be the new Damian Harris this year. But Elliott has caught 50-plus passes, not once, not twice, but 3 different times over the course of his season. But that has not happened in 3 years. 5.4 yards on 17 catches last year. I would imagine that this O'Brien code is being a little inflated for fantasy purposes. Not that he's trying to pump him up for fantasy purposes, but he's trying to pump him up in general. This is not a question necessarily on Ezekiel Elliott, who is going right now as I bring up my ADP on fantasymojo.com, a site that you should subscribe to if you are a FFPC player. Running back 46 at the 1109. Okay, that's where Elliott's going. But how does this affect a guy like Ramondre Stevenson, who has shot up not shot up, but he's definitely moved up draft boards? Running back 11 at the 311 right now. When you found out Elliott was signing with the Patriots, were you happy, indifferent, or sad about your Ramondre Stevenson shares this year, Jack?
I think in terms of who they could have signed, it was a relatively good outcome. Like if they had signed someone like Dalvin or Fournette, that's probably pretty bad for Ramondre's value. Obviously, if you have Ramondre, you would have preferred they signed no one, but it seemed pretty clear that they wanted to sign someone, and Zeke is not the end of the world there. I think the days of him being a pass catcher are pretty much done. He was playing on 3rd downs a pretty good amount for the Cowboys last year, and his target share was still in the 4 to 5% range. So I think Ramondre can still have a pretty robust target share. I think that Zeke is going to maybe vulture some of that short yardage work, but it's a similar thing where it's not like they're going to get within the 5, and Ramondre's carried it 3 times in a row and gotten them down inside the 5. But now that they're within striking distance, they're going to put Zeke in. I think Ramondre's still going to get his fair share of goal line carries. He's not a small back, so he can handle himself down there. Ramondre himself said at the end of last season that it began to wear on his body. So I think that this is just kind of making sure that he's not having a ridiculous load like he was in some of those weeks when Damian Harris was out last year. So yeah, I don't think it's the end of the world for Ramondre.
And the other thing to keep in mind with Stevenson, he was also being sat in preseason and during training camp on days when everybody else is practicing and he's just doing individual drills. And he said, like, look, what am I doing here? I want to get in shape. And the Patriots just like, yeah, you do your thing. We'll let you know when we need you, which to me is a clear representation of them understanding how important he is to their offense this year and wanting to take it easy in the preseason. This should not give us pause. This should give us a good reason to be drafting Ramondre Stevenson based on where he's going right now. So that's where you stand on Ezekiel Elliott. I know it was a roundabout question of asking that with Stevenson stuff. There have been a few players over the course of the last several months that it's been hard for me to wrap my head around here. And Najee Harris is one of them, Jack. Where do you stand on Najee Harris, a guy that has had a great rookie season, failed to live up to expectations the last couple of years from a season-long perspective? However, he has shown the chops. He's showing that he can do it. Dan Graziano from ESPN actually said this was, let's see, when was this? Earlier this afternoon, that don't be surprised if Jaylen Warren is the Steelers' lead running back by the end of the season. Now, to me, as long as Harris is healthy, I don't really see that happening. But his efficiency, his explosiveness, again, on a week-to-week basis, has been lacking. Warren is just an undrafted free agent. He's an UDFA. He doesn't have the draft pedigree that Harris does. But he did eat in to all the touches that Najee Harris was accumulating over the course of the last season. Non-zero chance that Warren overtakes Harris. I don't necessarily see it when you look at where Harris's ADP is right now in the Fantasy Pros Championship over the last 48 hours. We could see he is running back 13 at the 403. Can you sell us on why that is a great pick for anybody taking Najee Harris in the early fourth round, Jack?
I don't think I can, because I haven't been drafting Najee much. We saw over the second half of last season, Warren was playing on third downs and in clear passing situations over Harris. That continued in the preseason this year. They pretty much took Najee Harris out on third and longs and put Warren in. Warren played 40% of the snaps in the preseason. I agree with you that maybe it shouldn't matter, but the difference in draft capital with Harris as a first-round pick and Warren as an undrafted free agent might keep Harris locked in as the RB1, kind of like what we saw with Zeke and Pollard, where Pollard was the more explosive player, but they just kept handing the ball to Zeke. So that's kind of what I expect. I'm not super into Najee because the offense is probably – they look good in the preseason, but they're realistically probably – hoping to be an average offense. And with Warren taking 40% of the snaps overall and then the majority of the passing downs, I think it's a tough sell on Najee at RB13.
I think that's the thing. Is like and I know the Better Boss is chiming in right now. Don't poop emoji on Najee. And it's hard, I think what he does for the Steelers represents a value to fantasy teams. The problem is, and the problem I have in a lot of these guys, and what you just said, the problem you have with Najee Harris, not necessarily is the player, but the ADP and where you have to draft him. Running back 13 in the early fourth round, that's aggressive. He's going at the same spot as Aaron Jones, Travis Etienne, Breece Hall, who we talked about earlier, and Kenneth Walker, last season's offensive rookie of the year. So I think with Harris, if you love him, that's a fine spot to take him. But if you're unsure of him, think about all those other guys at running back that are going at the same spot before you end up going with Najee Harris, and that is where Jack Miller stands on Najee Harris. What about another running back here? David Montgomery. Eric Woodyard, who covers the Lions for ESPN, says that, again, this was several weeks ago, bear this in mind, that the Lions expect to be a two-headed monster at running back with both Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Montgomery has a 3.9 yard per carry average for the course of his entire career. He's had 6 missed games in 4 seasons. And since 2015, only 2 of 12 running backs drafted in the first round of the NFL draft have started less than 10 games. Those were Sony Michel, and now is Rashad Penny. So the numbers would certainly dictate that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be the guy. But you know what else is dictating that he's going to be the guy is the way that FFPC drafters are selecting him. Running back 9 at the 305 right now for Jahmyr Gibbs. David Montgomery is going all the way down at, let's see, where was he on this list? I apologize. Gonna have to control F this again. David Montgomery, running back 28 at the 704. Is that an appropriate expanse between Gibbs and Montgomery for you, Jack? Where do you stand on David Montgomery as running back 28 at the 704?
Yeah, I think Montgomery is undervalued, but I don't think it's necessarily at the expense of Gibbs, and I don't really think that Gibbs is overvalued. I think Montgomery is going to be stepping into that Jamal Williams short yardage role, and Gibbs is going to catch a ton of passes. So, I mean, we saw it's kind of like a few years ago when Kamara and Mark Ingram were on the Saints and both putting up big numbers. Kamara was like a first-round pick, and Ingram was like going in the 6th round sometimes. So I think that is like the ceiling there. And I think both of them have their roles. The thing about them is you probably don't want them on the same team because their upside cases kind of are prohibitive to each other. But as individual bets, I think both are good because Montgomery should have some decent touchdown upside, and he should see a good amount of carries. And then if something happens to Gibbs, he's shown the ability to be a 3-down back before, and so he could really just go crazy if Gibbs misses any time. And then Gibbs is going to catch a ton of passes, and if Montgomery misses time, maybe he steps into more of a lead rusher role and has like a massive season. So I think as individual bets, I think both of them are solid, and then Montgomery in particular, I think is probably a little undervalued right now.
What about and our producer Tyler Soto actually chiming in? He's incredibly high in Gibbs. He's been taking him in rounds 3 or 4 behind his receivers and quarterback. And I don't know what Tyler's playing, but even if it's a close 12-team league, I think you can make a case for that. But when you're drafting against thousands of other teams trying to win a 6 or 7-figure grand prize, Jack, I think that you have to look at maybe overdrafting a player like Gibbs because of his pick to win capability, right?
Can you say that again? Sorry, my stream.
No, that's right. I like Jahmyr Gibbs. When you're trying to beat out thousands of other teams, you want to take chances. You want to go with some upside maybe earlier than you normally would if you're just trying to beat 11 other teams. Is Jahmyr Gibbs the type of guy that is a pick to win type player in a national tournament?
I think he is, to be honest. I think the pass catching upside is really special here. We've seen like throughout the offseason, I mean, there have been videos that circulated on social media showing just how high the Lions are on Jahmyr Gibbs. It was kind of a shock when they drafted him, but it seemed like they were really concerned that they weren't even going to get him at 12, and they're really just in love with this guy. I think that dictates he's going to get a pretty big workload right out of the gate. And it seems like this is everyone's comparison, but he really does fit the Kamara comp pretty well with just if he can get 90 targets and also get 10 carries a game. I think that there's definitely a path to him being a league winner.
Well, let's talk about Kyren Williams here for a second. And the report that came out from Jordan Rodriguez from The Athletic, who covers the Rams there, said that she said that he could have a bigger impact in the passing game where he actually excelled throughout training camp. Jordan Rodriguez believes that not only Cam Akers will be deployed early, but Kyren Williams as well early in the season. But it's Williams that she thinks could emerge as the passing threat on this team, which we're always, as high-stakes players, we're always trying to find those pass-catching running backs. Matthew Stafford apparently looked pretty comfortable throwing to Kyren Williams as camp progressed. And I wonder if a report like this should have us shy away from Cam Akers, but have us zeroing in on Kyren Williams. To my point on this, if we look at the Fantasy Mojo, fantasymojo.com, and Fantasy Mojo on Twitter, of where these Rams running backs are being drafted, you're going to see that while Cam Akers is still the number 1 running back there, being selected as the running back 26 at the 701, Kyren Williams has been slowly creeping up, running back 61 at the 1512. Jack, is Kyren Williams simply an injury away type guy that we can only count on for fantasy value if Akers goes down? And is he worth a roster spot in the hopes that might happen? Or is he going to have some standalone value in Los Angeles this year based on Jordan Rodriguez's latest report here?
I think he's worth a roster spot, and I think he's going to have some standalone value. I'm not sure how much the pure pass catching back in the Rams offense is actually worth. But I do buy that he's going to be out there in some clear passing situations. And when the Kyron hype kind of started, I flashed back to last summer, because everything all summer was that the Rams were just absolutely in love with Kyron Williams. I think there was some stuff after week 1 that he was in line for a pretty big role, but he got hurt on the opening kickoff. So I think the Rams really like Kyron Williams, and this report just kind of reinforces that. He's a great pass protector, or at least he was heralded as such coming out of college. So I think it makes sense to have him in that pass catching role. I do think if Akers got hurt, it's not like Kyron Williams is suddenly carrying the ball 15 times a game. I think maybe Zach Evans starts to figure in. I think they could even go out and sign someone, and then the team doesn't project to be all that great. So I don't know how much upside there truly is, but I buy the report that he's kind of going to be the pass catching guy there, and there's some value in that, and it's in my opinion worth a roster spot.
The running back position has been well covered over the last hour on the show. Let's shift to the wide receiver position here, specifically Gabe Davis in Buffalo. I know there's a lot of people that are of the belief that the fact that Buffalo traded up to get Dalton Kincaid in the draft, and the fact that they're going to use him more as a wide receiver than a tight end, has a lot of people excited about Kincaid, but not very excited about Gabe Davis, a guy who has flashed some talent and tantalized us. I mean, obviously we think about that Bills-Chiefs divisional playoff game a couple of years ago. He's been great in small doses, but can he be big in a big dose, a season-long dose? That's the question right now. Gabe Davis right now in the Fantasy Pros Championship is going off as a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 36 at the 7-12 right now. Jack Miller from Establish the Run, where do you stand this year on Gabe Davis?
Yeah, I'm fine with Davis at his ADP. I don't have, a ridiculous amount, but he's going to be out there pretty much every snap. He has enormous spike week upside, which I think is one of the biggest selling points in his favor is any week he could go out there and have 2 or 3 touchdowns and just win you the week single-handedly. Kincaid is going to take some targets, but at least at the wide receiver position and the starting outside wide receiver position, Kincaid's not really a threat to him out there. So Gabe Davis is going to be out there a ton. Diggs, Kincaid, James Cook, all these guys are going to demand targets, but I think you can pretty easily project a mid to high teens target share for Gabe Davis. And with Josh Allen throwing him the ball and with his ability to make splash plays, I think he's a solid pick at ADP.
Yeah, and this is a player that I think we have to understand that he is not the player that we thought he was going to be when he went 8 for 200 with 4 touchdowns in that divisional playoff. I think that's ingrained in our minds, and I know it affected his ADP last year. I think it's affecting his ADP this year as well. When you can wrap your head around, like, look, this guy doesn't have to be the next big thing in Buffalo, the guy who's going to take over as the heir apparent to Stephon Diggs. He can still have value. Then I think his ADP makes a lot more sense as we look at drafting a player like that there, a player who can still make plays, maybe on an every week basis, but a week-to-week basis, which is what you're looking for at that point in the draft for sure. I promised everybody that we were going to get to Jahan Dotson. We're going to get to him right now. 3 catches for 72 yards in his final game with the Commanders last year against the Cowboys, and has been drawing a lot more buzz than that over the course of this season. The Terry McLaurin injury obviously contributing to that as well. Sky's up for Jahan Dotson. Every year we have when I do my high stakes fantasy football hour show live from the KFFSC, Jack, we have the hype player. We name the hype player of who the hype player is going to be, the player that is going to ascend, 2-3 rounds on that final weekend of drafting before week 1 kicks off. And my co-host, Stacey Perez from the Fantasy and Frames podcast, and I decided that it was going to be Jahan Dotson this year as our hype guy, as the guy that gets hyped up, and he has not disappointed. He is on the cusp of passing his teammate Terry McLaurin for being the number 1 Commanders wide receiver drafted. McLaurin at wide receiver 31, wide receiver 32 for Dotson right now. Dotson going at the 6'10". Is he worth the hype? Are you buying in and drinking the Jahan Dotson Kool-Aid right now, Jack Miller?
Yeah, I'm still good with Dotson at 6'10". I think a lot of people kind of overlook what he did last year. He had a kind of a slow start from a volume perspective. He was scoring touchdowns the whole year, which was, just kind of fluky. But from a volume perspective, he started pretty slowly. Then he missed some time. I think 4 or 5 weeks he missed. And then he came back in the first 3 weeks he was back. They eased him in. His snap share was not where it was either at the start or the end of the season when he was a full-time player. So they kind of took it slowly with him coming back from the injury. But then the last 5 games of the season, he had 5 straight games with at least a 20% target share. And I think like a 21% or maybe 23% cumulative target share over that stretch. So he was earning targets at a pretty high rate, even though, there was Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel to compete for targets with. He's a first-round pick. It just seems kind of logical that he could build on that and really take a step forward this year. The thing is that it's like Sam Howell and the Commanders' passing offense, which is not the best place to be on if you're trying to put together a truly massive season. But in terms of Jahan Dotson as an individual player, I'm pretty high on him. And so at 6'10", I think I'm just kind of betting on the talent there.
Bet on the talent is usually a safe option, and I think that's smart to do it right there for sure. Adam Thielen, we alluded to him earlier in the broadcast tonight. This is a guy that I have not drafted anywhere. I tend to draft wide receivers in the mid-rounds more for talent, hoping to get the opportunity. Adam Thielen certainly has shown chops as a possession receiver over the course of his career, but I think one of the worst seasons of his career was the 2022 year. Now he moves on. Brand new offense, OC, head coach, quarterback. There's a lot of stuff working against him here. What do you believe is the right spot to take Adam Thielen? Right now, FFPC players are declaring him as wide receiver 57 at the 1208, ahead of guys like Jameson Williams, Rashee Rice, and Zay Jones. But he's going behind guys like Jacoby Myers, Marvin Mims, and Alan Lazard. 1208 right now for Thielen. Does that seem too early, too late? Or as Goldilocks would say, Jack Miller, just right?
I think it's a little bit too high. Thielen's yards per route run has dropped in 5 straight seasons. He's, I think, 33 years old now. So I think he's basically on the twilight of his career. So, and that's typically not like an archetype I'm looking to draft. I think there's definitely a scenario in which he starts the year pretty hot. Chark is dealing with a hamstring injury. Mingo is a rookie who wasn't like a massive college producer. So I think Thielen is probably the favorite to lead them in targets week 1. And so I think there's maybe a universe where Thielen's a pretty good sell high after a week or two, because I'm not really trying to bet on him like sustaining a high level of production for an entire season. But as of now, it looks like might be Bryce Young's guy out of the gate. I mean, he's a safe slot receiver where, and his competition for targets are a rookie and a guy who's more of a deep threat and dealing with a hamstring injury. So yeah, I'm not looking to draft him a ton, but if you do draft him and he starts out hot, he might be a guy that you could get some pretty good value on in a trade or something like that if you're in a home league or something.
If you draft, like let's use that as an example. If you draft him like late, 12th, 13th round or whatever, let's say he doesn't hit, do you still feel like you have to keep him around and try to trade him rather than just outright release him? Or would you not have any qualms about this guy and Adam Thielen if he doesn't hit in the first 3 weeks to just send him to the waiver wire and let him be somebody else's problem and get nothing for it?
Yeah, that's a good question, because he does seem like a guy who could have like 4 catches for 42 yards every week. And, every 4 weeks he has a touchdown. And so he's putting up points still, but it doesn't really help you. And so that's a tough spot to be in. I think if he establishes that he's not going to put up a massive target share, which is probably his path to paying off ADP, and it's possible. I mean, he needs like a big target share as the slot guy, just kind of Bryce Young's trusted underneath option. I think that's the thing. Thielen needs to be like a top 30 receiver. So if it becomes clear that he's not going to put like a huge target share up, then that's when I think you just kind of cut ties.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's a good rubric for looking at it as well. Shifting to the tight ends here, I had a decision to make in one of my dynasty leagues. I'm going to frame this question from a dynasty and redraft standpoint. If the answer is the same for both, feel free to give that. I had to cut down in one of the dynasty leagues I took over this year. My three tight ends were Hayden Hurst, Mike Gesicki, and Luke Musgrave. Okay, so I had to cut one of these guys. I just could not keep all 3 of them based on how my team was set up at running back and receiver. Which one of those guys would you have cut for dynasty? Obviously not Luke Musgrave, but between Hurst and Gesicki, who has the better value going forward?
Yeah, I don't play a whole lot of Dynasty. I mostly stick to season long, so I'm probably not the best guy to ask. For this year, I prefer Hurst. But Gesicki seems like I don't think Gesicki is going to be all that great this year, but he does seem like a guy who maybe he has the athleticism. Maybe someone turns him into like a top 15 tight end eventually. Where I don't really think Hurst has that upside, and Hurst is also kind of getting up there in age a little bit. To be honest, I don't really know how to balance that from a dynasty perspective, but in season long, I prefer Hurst.
Okay, so that's the decision I made. I kept Musgrave and Hurst. I let Gesicki go. I mean, he's obviously hurt right now. He's got to contend with Hunter Henry there. But with when you talk about Hayden Hurst, obviously we're not going to use the term upside. But when you have a rookie quarterback there, and Thielen and these other Mingo's obviously there's a lot of new faces on that passing game. Could Hurst, what's the potential, because Hurst would be my backup on this team, what's the potential that, if something happens to Musgrave or quite frankly, anybody start at tight end where they have Hurst as a backup, that he just, you plug him in there and you could expect, 4 for 38 or 5 for 60 or something like that. What's his, week to week? I mean, is it pretty volatile that what you see in Hurst this year from a season long standpoint, or is there a certain amount of value in drafting him as your second tight end?
Yeah, I've been drafting him a pretty good amount. I think he's a pretty safe bet for volume. He was on, the Bengals last year competing for volume with Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. Obviously, Chase and Higgins missed some games, but he had a 14% target share last year. Now he's competing for targets with Adam Thielen, DJ Chark, and Jonathan Mingo. So if he can put up a 14% target share on the Bengals, I think there's a pretty interesting ceiling target share for him here in Carolina. The first 2 weeks of the preseason were really encouraging for that. He ran a route on every one of Bryce Young's dropbacks. The third week, he kind of had weirdly low usage, so I don't really know what to make of what happened in that third preseason game. But I'm not really panicking about it, and maybe I'm just sticking to my priors too much. But yeah, I think Hurst could be in line for a pretty high target share. I think definitely he could be that guy who gets 4 or 5 catches a week for 45 yards, and sometimes he finds the end zone, and that is sometimes valuable if you're ever in a pinch.
I want to ask you about the third tight end in that scenario, Luke Musgrave, that we just talked about. Let's answer this from a redraft standpoint. This is a player who has leapfrogged Michael Mayer and to a certain extent Darnell Washington in the Fantasy Pros Championship, the FFPC main event. He's obviously ahead of Luke Schoenmaker as well. I don't think he's in any kind of threat of overtaking Sam Laporta this late in the game, where he's basically being drafted 2.5 rounds behind Laporta. But you look at Musgrave as an end of the 12th, maybe mid to late end of the 12th round pick here for redraft. I'm biased. I'm in Northeast Wisconsin, but I see Jordan Love throwing to him a lot. I hear the coaches and Love talking very positively about Musgrave this year. I see it with my own eyes, the speed at that tight end position that has not been in Green Bay probably since Jermichael Finley was there a decade plus ago. I'm starting to like Luke Musgrave at that mid to late 12th round pick. And quite frankly, in an FFPC tight end premium league, I think he's a borderline slam dunk there if you need a tight end.
Yeah, I think Musgrave is fine. He's risen pretty significantly, and I do remain a little just wary of especially the non-day one rookie tight ends, but it does seem like he's in line for an every down role, and it's not like he has unbeatable target competition. So I definitely get where it's coming from. I'd say his price is fair, and he's not someone I'm drafting a ton of, but I don't think he's supremely overvalued or anything like that.
So you're right in the middle. If he's there, he's there. If he's not, you're okay with, but you're not reaching for him either.
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. I'm glad we got on board with the Luke Musgrave discussion here. By the way, join all our live talk shows here on the Better Sports Network on the YouTube channel for BSN. You can actually call in or live chat with our hosts and community, which a lot of people you have been doing tonight, which we appreciate. And you can always see all of our shows and clips from our best moments and interviews on YouTube, Twitter, and at bettersports.com. Those are the 3 avenues for you there. We have one more segment here, and I always like to save the best for last. Jack Miller is in and established the run. What do you call it? The ETN Stat Nerds or whatever it's called? The name of the team?
Yeah, Leone named the team, and we're the ETR Nerds.
The ETR nerds, just ETR nerds. Okay, perfect. So we're going to get into that. We're actually going to get into the draft itself and some of the picks. I don't want to give them all away because I know you're live blogging this, which is really good. It's a really good read at Establish the Run and a really good listen too. But we're going to talk about strategy when you're drafting for $1 million grand prize, how strategy changes based on beating 1,000 teams as opposed to just 11 other teams. We're going to get into some of the picks that Jack Miller and his teammates have made tonight, including Samaje Perine, Christian Kirk, and others. It's all coming up here in the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show, exclusively on the Better Sports Network. Don't go anywhere. It rolls on after this.
I feel like this is a quietly contentious point in Dynasty Fantasy Football, what it means to actually be rebuilding. Some people say you should never truly be rebuilding. How do you view the rebuilding versus competing dichotomy in Dynasty?
So I will be the first person to acknowledge that my preferred format of fantasy football is just redraft. The years that I have played Dynasty, it has been I've drafted a win now team because I've seen people that have just gotten into the cycle of rebuilding and thus they just don't make any progress. So if you're rebuilding for the 5th year in a row, I just, I don't know exactly how you get out of it, but yeah, it's definitely something that can happen. And a lot of people, especially when we come out of the NFL draft, everyone's just instantly shipping off, draft picks and everything. So, I mean, it's definitely something that can happen.
Joey, do you feel similarly to it? Do you feel like you see people getting stuck in the rebuilding loop?
I mean, I would say people that try to rebuild in the beginning of seasons, of their fantasy seasons, I see them get stuck in that rut. I would really try to only ever rebuild if I knew I was going to miss the playoffs. Like, I'm always trying to play to win, even if it's maybe I don't know.
I think my big thing is the word rebuild is a much shorter time frame than I think most people say it should be. Like, they look at rebuild as like 3 years out competing. Rebuild, you're looking to compete next season. You know what I mean? Like, if you're doing it now, you're looking to revamp, and maybe there's a one season where you ship it off, but that very next season you should be competing. If you're doing it like that, I'm cool with it, but you gotta have a plan, not just keep getting the young players, keep getting the draft picks. Otherwise, you end up like Tim. Maybe not like Tim who gets a bye, but you make the playoffs, you're in that like 4 to 6 range every year, just hovering in the middle. Nothing ever gets better, nothing ever gets worse.
I think I play like you in Dynasty, Simon. I play in 3-year windows.
100%. That's my go-to. And with the rate at which Dynasty leagues turn over, you should really only ever play in a 3-year window.
19 minutes until the top of the hour here on the Better Sports Network. It is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show. I'm Eric Balkman from the FFPC, the High Stakes Fantasy Football, or the RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown, and of course joined by Jack Miller from Establish the Run. Follow him on Twitter/X. God, I'm going to take a drink every time I say Twitter instead of X. At JackMiller02 on Twitter, and all his work over at Establish the Run, including all this stuff you've been posting about your main event slow draft. This is the first time you've been a part of a main event draft this year. What has the experience just been like, knowing that you guys are competing for a $1 million grand prize this year, Jack?
Yeah, it's actually my first main event period, just because, in past years, the entry fee was a little bit prohibitive, but I'm hoping next year, honestly, to go out to Vegas for the live drafts. I think those would be super fun. But yeah, this is my first main events, and I think we're doing pretty well there. We've had a couple cases where we were hoping a guy would fall to us, and he did. There were a couple times we wanted a quarterback to fall to us, and they did not. So, it is what it is. I think overall, I like this team. Leone has done a few main event teams, and he says that this is like his favorite team so far. So I think that's a good sign, and hopefully we win the $1 million.
How deep are you guys into this? Is this like 11, 12? What round?
We are midway through the 12th.
12th, okay. And what spot were you guys picking from?
7th.
When you guys found out that you were picking from the 7th spot, what was the conversation like? What was the strategy when you knew that, okay, we're going to have to wait for a half round to go off the board before we find out our guy here. But you can kind of tell, like, based on ADP and based on where you're picking on the board, you kind of know the positions and the players you want to target. Can you take us into your mind and everybody's mind here on what you wanted to accomplish from the 7 spot?
Yeah, definitely. We felt pretty good about 7 because we thought that there were like 7 guys and we were just going to take who fell. And that would be Jamar, Travis Kelce, Justin Jefferson, Kupp, McCaffrey, Tyreek, and Eckler. I was hoping we didn't get Kupp because I'm a little bit scared of like the systemic stuff with the Rams, and I guess, and we didn't end up getting Kupp, and I guess that's lucky given the news today about his hamstring. But we ended up taking Eckler just because he was the last guy there from that tier, and so it wasn't really like a huge decision or debate. It was just kind of, we had 7, we thought there were 7 guys, and we drafted the one that was left.
So I totally biffed on this. I should have asked you about Cooper Kupp earlier. 3 hours ago, Andrew Siciliano said that Sean McVay told everybody that Cooper Kupp has had a setback. He's now day-to-day with his muscle strain. 10 days away for a 30-year-old receiver to get healthy from a soft tissue injury coming off ankle surgery. I believe it was ankle surgery coming off last year. At least it was an ankle injury, a serious ankle injury. He's going right now, as I look at the Fantasy Mojo on this, for as far as ADP goes, wide receiver 4 at the 107. Knowing what you know now, how far are you letting Cooper Kupp slip in your drafts?
I honestly don't think I would take him in the first round, but I've been a little low on Kupp the whole time because between him staying healthy, between Stafford staying healthy, between the Rams kind of just looking like a disaster outside of Stafford, Kupp, and Aaron Donald. There's just a lot of stuff. The upside, I think, is ridiculous. Like, we saw the upside 2 years ago. I think that is still within the range of outcomes if everything breaks right. But the downside is just so scary with Kupp. So I haven't been drafting a ton of him.
How does and we've danced around this topic throughout the program tonight. How does your strategy change when you're trying to win $1 million in a national tournament, in a managed league too, by the way, not best ball, as opposed to trying to win $1 million drafting the best ball team, trying to beat 11 other team owners in a local league, a fantasy, like a family friends, office league or whatever? How does your strategy change when this is a managed league where you're gunning for $1 million, trying to beat thousands of other teams?
Yeah, I think you really have to focus on late season upside and getting guys that can break at the right time and turn into league winners, because it happens every year. There's a couple of guys that break out over the second half of the season, and so you really need to hit on those. I think correlation within your own team is a good idea too. Maybe not as important as it is in some of the big best ball contests where it just like comes down to like week 17 and that's all that matters. But I still think that if you can get correlation, that's a good idea. But really, it just does come down to hitting on the guys that can break out at the right time. And, it's hard to engineer this in advance, but you want to obviously hit on the guys that break out at the right time that the other people don't have.
EstablishTheRun.com is where to go to check out the FFPC main event live slow draft blog written by Jack Miller, Mike Leone, Mark Dankebring. All those guys are drafting this FFPC main event right now, and you can follow along with all the picks there. But I do want to center on a couple of picks here tonight. Christian Kirk, first of all, at the 606. We didn't really talk a whole lot about Calvin Ridley. I am not on Team Ridley this year. I think the fact that he has been away from the game so long and the fact that he is now being almost a borderline second-round pick, to me, the price is too high on that, which means if I don't like Calvin Ridley, I probably should like Christian Kirk. Not targeting Kirk, but I'm definitely taking him when the value represents itself, or, just not even value, just taking him where he's normally going. You guys took him at 606. I don't think that's very far off from where his value is. As far as his ADP, that's pretty spot on. Where do you guys fall in on the Ridley versus Kirk discussion this year?
I'm kind of in on both, mostly just because I think the Jags offense could take a big step forward this year. Trevor Lawrence was like a top 5 or 10 quarterback by like advanced metrics and PFF over the second half of the season. He's been heralded as generational since he was in high school, really. And we've seen kind of a slow and steady increase from him through his first 2 years in the league. So it seems like he's the type of guy where maybe he takes that like final step into like a Joe Burrow-esque ascension. That's, maybe not a likely outcome, but I think it's a possible outcome. And if that happens, then I think Ridley and Kirk both have enormous ceilings. And Kirk probably isn't going to be the wide receiver one for him like he was last year with Ridley in town, but he's still in line for a pretty significant target share. I mean, they trot out the same 4 guys in Ridley, Kirk, Zay Jones, and Ingram on basically every play. Running backs did not have a huge target share for the Jags last year. So yeah, I think Kirk can still have a pretty good target share, even if Ridley is the primary guy. And then if Ridley gets hurt or something, then Kirk could, really have a massive season.
Yeah, and I think that's what you got to look at, especially from, these big offenses like this that have all these playmakers. This is a game that has 100% injury return. Like, everybody's going to get hurt at some point, and if you can cash in on those weeks at the right time, can make all the difference in the world. Do you have any, like, when we talk about trying to beat out thousands of other teams here, do you have a player or players that are picks to win when you consider what you just talked about, the whole late season spike week potential to capture lightning in a bottle for these players to go off in the championship round, any of the 3 weeks in the championship round? Are there any pick to win players that maybe you've already drafted or that you're looking to draft? I don't want you to give anything away, but if you want to, we'd be more than willing to hear it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think 2 guys, these are kind of early round guys, but Jordan Addison and Zay Flowers, we drafted Addison on this team. I think both of them first round picks, good passing offenses, good quarterbacks. And so maybe they don't come out of the gates with a massive target share, but there's scenarios where they both have pretty big target shares near the end of the season. Zay Flowers maybe has the upside to like just be the wide receiver one on his team just because he proves that he's the best, whereas Jordan Addison probably needs a Justin Jefferson injury. But even without a Jefferson injury, I think he can put up some decent numbers. And then later on, I guess sticking with the rookie theme, since we talked about that earlier, how that they tend to improve throughout the season. Jaden Reed is a guy that I think is super undervalued right now. Honestly, I don't get the ADP gap between him and Romeo Doubs. Doubs, I think, played pretty well last year, given the situation he was thrust into, being a day 3 pick. A day 3 pick thrust into a starting role for an Aaron Rodgers offense. He performed pretty admirably, but Jaden Reed was productive his freshman season at Western Michigan, productive in Michigan State, got significantly better draft capital, and has been the star of Packers training camp. So I honestly, I think I would take Reed over Doubs straight up. And from a lot of the sites ADPs this summer, that's a pretty contrarian opinion. So he's a guy, and then Jalen Hyatt, probably not going to do much week 1. But I think the Giants could pass a little bit more this year. They started to do that at the end of last season. They signed Waller. They kind of dragged their feet on Saquon. They extended Danny Dimes. So maybe we see a little bit more passing, and maybe by the end of the season, Hyatt is into a bigger role. He's not a guy I'm like as high on, but I think you could pretty easily tell yourself a story where he just goes, and he's also has that spike week upside, the big play, the speed guy, where he could just break a slate.
I can tell you that Jones is a guy that's coming on in drafts. Not a ton, but he's moving up a little bit right now in ADP. I want to get back to that Packers discussion here. The gap is closing on Doubs and Jaden Reed right now. In fact, if you look at what's going on over the last 2 days in our mid-stakes championship over at the FFPC at myffpc.com, Doubs wide receiver 48, Jaden Reed now wide receiver 64. Doubs is going at 10:01. Jaden Reed is going at 14:06. So you're looking at about 4.5 rounds. And remember, Doubs is dealing with a hamstring injury right now. So as we enter these final 10 days up until the start of the NFL draft, where drafting season is no longer going to be existing, you're going to see Jaden Reed close that gap even more. Not sure he ever overtakes Doubs in this, but there's a non-zero chance of anything, as I always like to say. But I bet that gap definitely gets tightened. I'm not going to reveal the 3 rookies you guys have on your squad. Everybody can go to establishthерun.com to check that out, to find out which rookies you've drafted. But I do want to ask you, 3 rookies in the first 10 rounds. You talked about getting these guys that could be crescendoing at the end of the season. How important is it for you guys to get these unknowns, these relative unknowns in these rookies? Well, they may have the draft capital. They've never done it on the field before. How important is it to add these rookies onto your squads at this point in the draft when you're coming up on rounds 8, 9, 10?
Yeah, I think if the opportunity presents itself, it makes sense. I don't think we went into this draft saying let's draft a bunch of rookies. It just kind of turned out that way, especially I'll just reveal this one, especially with Jackson Smith and Jigba. We thought about taking him in the 7th round. So then it just happened that he lasted another round. And so it was just kind of an easy decision there. But yeah, I mean, it was, besides JSN, the other 2 were hard decisions. It wasn't we were let's go out and get ourselves a bunch of rookies. So that's kind of how that played out.
And it makes sense, obviously, when you're trying to, again, you have to beat out thousands of other teams. If you get all these guys going for, and you start them all in that final week, that's massive. That's what you need. Think about the guys, the Go Bills, the Marv Levy franchise last year that went back to back in the FFPC main event. Don Bargnani, Sean Stutzman, and of course, Mike Costantino. That they ended up making one lineup decision in week 15 that ended up cementing them as the champions. And that was just as simple as substituting in a running back as opposed to Bam Knight. I can't remember who it was. I want to say it was somebody from the Chiefs. I could be wrong on that. Don't quote me on that. But it was basically one running back decision that vaulted them up to first place. You already talked about how you feel about the team so far. I don't want to necessarily focus on that. Let's talk about Samaje Perine. I've been the biggest Javonte Williams guy based on all the information that's trickling out of Denver. Sean Payton seems to be very high on him. Everybody seems to be very happy about how the injury is progressing. Is Perine a value for you guys? You took him in the 10th round.
Yeah, I don't think he's a smash pick or anything. And the news about Javonte has been almost unbelievably positive. But I do think that Perine's going to open the year with a pretty decent role, because I think they're going to take Javonte kind of slowly, kind of like what the Jets are going to do with Breece Hall. And then even once Javonte is fully healthy, maybe Perine holds on to a little bit of passing down work and change of pace carries here and there. And if Javonte either can't get back to his old self, or if he suffers another injury, the contingent upside on Perine's pretty good. So I think it's just that archetype of some standalone value, and then if something happens to their other guy, then he turns into a potential league winner. And so that's kind of the archetype we're looking for here in these double-digit rounds with the running backs.
Jack, if you meet somebody on the street, they recognize you and they say, "Hey, that's Jack Miller from Establish the Run." I have 30 seconds to ask them about fantasy football this season in the FFPC main event, the Fantasy Pros Championship. You have 30 seconds to tell this guy what he needs to know for winning $1 million. What would you tell him?
I'd probably say make sure you don't fall behind at wide receiver. I think if you only have 30 seconds, making sure someone structures their team correctly, get a running back or 2 early on, and then just make sure you're not too far behind at receiver, and then that you can kind of put together a group of 0 RB candidates later on and hope someone breaks out.
And I think that's good advice. And I think that's the way a lot of people do it, for sure. And it has a very good proven track record of success. Jack, the best way to consume more of your content, obviously following you on X at JackMiller02. Go to EstablishTheRun.com. Is there anything else that I'm forgetting?
No, that's pretty much it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for popping aboard tonight. I want to thank Jack Miller, our producer, Tyler Soto. We're back next week live at Planet Hollywood in Las Vegas with Draft Sharks Matt Schauf at 7 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be broadcasting live. That show will bleed into the start of the game, so you'll have your 2-screen experience going on. Remember that you can still have time to win a pair of $1 million grand prizes at myffpc.com with the Fantasy Pros Championship, the FFPC main event. Play fantasy football year-round at myffpc.com. 1,500 plus leagues for over a decade. None have ever folded at all. MyFFPC.com is your home for that, as well as $5 leagues where you can just compete for fun against people, 11 people rather than 11,000 people. You can do that at MyFFPC.com. And we will be back next week I do. Jack, thank you so much. I hope you win the FFPC main event this year. It'll be so much fun to talk to you as the next FFPC millionaire.
Oh, that'll be great. And yeah, thank you guys for having me on.
Absolutely. Jack Miller from Established Run. Check him out. Jack Miller02 on Twitter. Dynasty Nerds with Garrett Price is up next here on the Better Sports Network. Be good, everybody. We'll talk with you again next week.